What's up, gifted family? Welcome to another episode of the show that is the GP YouTube. Just a reminder that if you support what we do here, make sure to go over to giftedperformance.com and sign up for our automated coaching service. For only $1 a day, you'll get access to 15 highly customized training programs, a macronutrient calculator, our meal planning feature that lets you build and save meals based on your macros, as well as access to our private Facebook group. All subscriptions help us in continuing to put out great content to get you to your fitness goals. Thanks for stopping by, and without any further delay, let's get into today's video. Enjoy.
Welcome back, guys. Another episode of the Gifted Performance Podcast, the GPP, where we give you the information and practical takeaways to improve your own general physical preparedness. I am flanked by a doctor. His name is Michael. I'm flanked by a robot. His name is Thomas. Gentlemen at the top of my screen, how are you guys doing today on this fine evening?
I'm doing wonderful.
That's good. Happy to have you.
Doing kind of shitty.
Kind of shitty. Tom just had a small crisis. Tom, you want to walk us through the crisis? Twitter format it for us.
280 characters.
Yeah.
We'll say 2 weeks old. We had a blowout.
Yes. Dookie supposed to be in. Dookie go out. Bad time. Something like that.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, that's
okay.
My son's gonna see me on YouTube one day when he's like 19 or 20, and he's just gonna get roasted endlessly by his friends about the time he shit his pants.
And we are happy to be joined by two gentlemen known as, I don't even know if you guys are known as this. Mike has only ever called you guys this, the DDS boys. I believe that's 2 or 3 Z's down there at the bottom. The data-driven strength gentlemen. I would like to introduce you, but we're going to do something a little special here on this introduction. The person who gets the first introduction is the one with the higher total. So who right now, currently in their current state, would have the higher total?
So Zac is currently a little he's out of it. He's operating on one lung right now. Luckily, Dr. Taylor here on the call has helped both Zac and I out as I rehab a pec injury and Zac rehabs having only one lung. So honestly, I'll go ahead and introduce myself. As you'll probably tell, I'm not a huge fan of talking about myself, but I'll try to make it brief, and it'll probably cover both Zac and I's introductions because we're pretty similar guys and have a similar background. Zac and I both went to Ohio State University to get our undergrads in exercise science, and I was actually, funny enough, a while back, I was on like the physical therapy route, and I remember like running across Dr. Taylor's stuff, and so like I was following Dr. Taylor while I was still like on the physical therapy route, but I eventually dabbled in some exercise science research, primarily in clinical populations, and I was like, this is really cool stuff. I kind of want to go this research route. I met Zac through that, and then he went down to Florida Atlantic University under the mentorship of Dr. Zordos. And then I followed him a few semesters later. And so right now we're research assistants, master students at Florida Atlantic University. And yeah, we run a company called Data Driven Strength where we hope people will listen to what we have to say. And that's about it, man.
All right, Zac, he handled the introduction on the personal side. Let's hear an introduction on the business side. So tell me a little bit about data-driven strength, what you guys do, what the mission statement is there.
Yeah, so I think we started, kind of just as a general kind of just helping some buddies out with programming at the kind of the rec center at Ohio State, and have kind of progressed it since we kind of got into research. We wanted to take our experience in kind of the lab, but also combine that with, what we did in the gym and really take the research process process and make that applicable to essentially every lifter throughout the timeline of experience, whether that be somebody stepping in the gym for the first time or somebody that's been doing this for a long time. That's something we've really tried to kind of take our mission statement and really make research something that's not just this big scary kind of thing that people don't really know how to apply, and try to make it extremely actionable, kind of no matter what lifters kind of coming across our stuff. And yeah, just kind of take the scare quotes out of research and make it something that everybody can utilize to their benefit.
Right on. I think that's a really valuable spot to be in this field, as is serving as that liaison, and it's a serious skill set, because you have a lot of people that think that they do it well, but they really don't, because they like the smell of their farts so much that they just throw these big words out there like, look at me, bask in all that is me. Whereas the majority of your content, both of you guys, because you do a phenomenal job of it, a lot of your content is very easy to read, very easy to digest. And I think that's why, I mean, I'm sure that's a big reason why you've seen such a big spike in popularity in such a short amount of time.
It definitely wasn't always that way. I think that's one thing we always like to remind ourselves on, and just kind of when we kind of do a self audit of like, hopefully we're headed in the right direction, is like, we definitely had that phase of like, going through using every word in the thesaurus to like try to, flex our scientific egos, being like saying stuff that, just didn't apply. But once we really reflected on exactly like, kind of like I said, what is the purpose of what we're doing? And it's essentially to translate that information to anyone. And ultimately the way to do that best is make it applicable and understandable by anyone. So that's kind of the theme we've tried to make with our content, is making it, like you said, digestible, and anyone can look at it and hopefully take at least something away that they can go apply into the gym the next day or the next week of training, whatever it is. So yeah, as we've kind of transitioned from trying to make ourselves sound smart and just, letting the information that's a little bit easier to understand do the talk, and that's, hopefully where we can continue to build on that. And I'm sure we still do that to some degree, and we can hopefully continue to build on that and not just, like you said, like the smell of our own farts.
So before we dig too far into it, the feud that you guys have had with meme accounts, would you care to comment about maybe some bad blood out there? Some people whose necks you want to put on the chopping block?
Oh man, Zach, that's all you, man. I think you were more tangled up in that than I was.
So, I really try to view that in the most positive light we can, and try to, and I'm not trying to make this too political of an answer, but I'm going to some degree, I'm sure. But you can view that in two ways, right? You can view that as a personal attack and something that you can be defensive about and ultimately turn it into like a negative situation, or you can take that and try to use it positively. And I think that's kind of what we've tried to do, is take, maybe some comments that are a little bit more negative and something we may view as strawmanning us in some way, but ultimately view that to hopefully communicate our points more efficiently and articulate what we actually mean better. And regardless of, whether we agree with the criticisms of us or not, the reality is, if somebody takes that away from what we're saying and don't exactly understand, there's fault on our part regardless. So I think taking that and turning that into a positive and just doing a better job of articulating exactly what we mean, so that anybody that comes across our content won't take something out of context. I think that's something, regardless of whether we agree with some of the criticisms or not, that's something we can take and hopefully build on and use as a positive.
Just to add something in right here, Ryan, you had mentioned how some of our stuff is rather easy to digest, and we try to make it that way so that, if you're on Instagram and you're trying to scroll past and you don't care to spend 5 minutes reading something, you can take something away from it, while also having the nuance there for the people that want it. And also just like in terms of like a intellectual humility standpoint, we want that stuff to be there. So it's a very fine line to walk in terms of giving things that are actually applicable, actionable, and can reach more than two people, while also having the intellectual caution and stating things, with the degree of confidence to the degree of evidence we have to support that claim. And we've messed up at times. We try to take any criticisms on the chin, but like Zach said, it's just I'm sure 2 years from now we'll look back and be like, man, we were messing something up back then. And if that's not the case, we're probably not moving in the right direction. So it's a balance we're trying to strike, and we definitely have messed up in the past, and I'm sure we'll continue to do so, but hopefully we can just reduce the error bars over time.
I think to come back to our kind of original mission too, like one thing that's difficult I find oftentimes is that if our end goal is to help people and kind of try to communicate these ideas that ultimately is going to lead to what we think is a positive action, sometimes the terminology or the way you communicate idea may not be technically correct in like the most scientific way, but certain terms resonate better with especially the average lifter. So like kind of balancing that of like, for example, a lot of our content using the term low RPE, that resonates with people immediately, but oftentimes that isn't exactly the most accurate term to use. Like, so we originally kind of communicated a lot of those ideas by saying intraset fatigue. That's more accurate in terms of what we're actually saying, but half the people don't know what the hell that means. So it isn't as, it doesn't get as much traction in terms of actually impacting what people are doing in the gym. So it's finding that balance of using the terminology and also knowing what is going to resonate with the average lifter to kind of balance that process of communication. I find is something that just makes that whole discussion that we just had a little bit more difficult too. And like Josh said, I'm sure we've kind of erred on the wrong side of that equation probably a few times, and we'll continue to do so. But that's just another variable that kind of adds to that whole picture of maybe some people taking away something from our content that maybe isn't exactly what we intend.
Man, that was probably the most poised and graceful answer to that question, because that was a trap. That was absolutely a trap. And that's like, you guys really handled that well, and not as well as I would have handled it. And my baby's been sleeping like 4 hours at a time, and I got time today. But the low RPE thing kind of set me off. Mike and I had a big long sidebar about that, with just how stupid that whole saga became. We thought it was very clear, like what you guys were trying to communicate in that instance, and even to the degree that like time under the bar kind of vets that out. And you talk to any really experienced, really strong guy, and they're like, man, everything over 500 sucks, and like it might be 60% of his max, but like Milanichev, he puts 500 back. He says that hurts, like, oh yeah, it's only 60%. Well, if you only squat 400, sure. If you squat 1,000, it all hurts. And, and I think that some of that gets missed. And then one of the things that came out with that whole deal with it just drove me up the wall is the guy came at you with some ad homs about, like your personal performance and how strong you guys were individually and all this. And I'm looking at the specific character, open powerlifting is a thing, man. Like all of your lifts are on the internet. Like if you haven't benched 300 pounds in a meet, shut up, like don't come after somebody else's numbers. So, yeah, just I like the way y'all handled that question, and that's good perspective. For me, I get a little hot-headed sometimes, and we'll just say stuff. But
yeah, I think it's we try to do this as much as possible, and if anybody's listening to this and we say something once we kind of start talking about training stuff that they disagree with or they think they have another angle at, we try to be as open as possible, like inviting critiques. It's just like, okay, if a productive discussion is a remote possibility, then we'll happily engage. Like, I'm not going to like give any names or anything, but we had a few people we respect very much so recently, and they're like, hey, we think you got something wrong in kind of the model you guys talk about. And we talked about it for multiple weeks trying to like, okay, what is the base disagreement? And we eventually worked it out, came to an agreement. Everybody came to the table willing to change their minds. And that's how, in the process, we developed our understanding of our model. They probably learned something too. And that's how we progress, as opposed to, these silly things on social media. So
yeah, well, and social media is like hyper toxic anyways. I mean, nothing productive ever came from memes, ever. I mean, so yeah, I think that probably being poised and big enough to move beyond that when that's where the I don't want to use the word opposition, but the dissenting opinion is coming from a perspective of like, I'm going to post a meme and let my 75,000 19-year-old followers dunk on you, with no context or, no understanding is, that takes a lot to do that.
So Mike T has kind of left. Oh, he's back just in time. So Mike T writes a question here. His question was regarding kind of the special sauce behind DDS. So his personal term. Actually, you know what? Now that he's back, I don't even want to ask his question in a poor manner. Mike, special sauce question. Let's hear it. You're on mute,
yes,
by the way.
Sorry.
Oh,
I'm off mute. I'm back.
Oh, okay.
Sorry. I had daycare calling me. Tom and I are both just going through it right now, man. Anyway, my question
I believe in your original email to these folks right here, when they had to propose a later recording date, you told them that their priorities were out of line. So,
yes,
guys, this is your chance. Maybe let him know.
Yeah, I know it's coming back to bite me. So, no, my question is, what do you think? So I'm very cognizant of how you try to present yourselves when you're, creating content, communicating on, Instagram and on your various media forms. But what do you think sets you apart? You guys are not like the first like evidence-based powerlifting people, right? But I feel like I see data-driven strength shared everywhere, right? Like daily, because you guys are really good about putting out consistent content. And I see like a lot of, I see a lot of conversation, discussion, and I just kind of wonder, is that something that you guys have to like deliberately work on? My opinion is I think it's y'all's brand. I think it's like really like aesthetically pleasing above all else. And then I zoom in, I look at the content and I'm like, oh, that's cool. It's nuanced and thoughtful. Cause I mean, I've been a subscriber to Mass for like, basically 4 years now. I think they put out their fourth issue today. And, I read it, but, Mass, despite being an awesome resource, is not like to speak negative about it, doesn't seem to move the needle quite the same way. And I just kind of wonder like what you think you guys do that's so effective in that regard.
Me? You?
I'll jump in with a quick initial thought, then I'll pass it to you, Zach, just because something came to mind. I think, and this is kind of ironic given the name of our company is Data Driven Strength, is obviously we try to use research as our compass, but sometimes we're like, maybe having a company name that implies that we're strictly by the books or strictly based on the research, or every single coaching decision or programming decision we make has to be based on research is a little bit misleading. And I think we're willing to, kind of take the research as well as acknowledge the limitations of the research. I would argue that truly being evidence-based is also understanding the limitations of the research and kind of making our best bet in practice with even giving the gaps in our knowledge. So I think it's probably just a degree of integrating experience. And again, we try to be clear when something isn't truly evidence-based. And again, we try to scale our degree of confidence with the level of evidence that it has to support. So I think, again, ironically, we probably get labeled as like very strictly evidence-based individuals, but again, there's limitations there. So I'd kind of argue that being truly evidence-based is also acknowledging the limitations there and still making your best bet in terms of practice. But Zach, I don't know if you have anything to add there.
Yeah. The way I think about it is like, we had this conversation one day, Josh. I almost view kind of our role in the kind of the community right now, or at least one of our roles, there's other people that do the same thing. I guess it's just the way I view kind of what we're doing is, we try to, as well as we like to read the research and like keep our ear to the ground with that stuff. I think we also try to keep our ear to the ground in terms of what are real coaches doing and what are new ideas that they have and maybe isn't related to research at all. And I think our role is kind of taking the two ends of the spectrum there and connecting the things as best as we can. And as Josh said, oftentimes what I think that is, we take the limitations of the current research as well as the positive findings, and we kind of try to fit everything together and make practical recommendations. Now, those aren't always purely based on the research, but we try to state the difference there and just kind of try to connect, different concepts that coaches are using and try to make sense with what we see in the research. It kind of going back to the low RPE example, something we like to always make clear is we are not reinventing the wheel there by any means. Boris Shako's been doing this forever, and we just kind of try to combine that with maybe some of the more modern approaches of taking submaximal top sets pretty consistently, like Mike T single at RP8. We're just kind of combine those two ideas with some stuff from the research, and we didn't really do anything there. We just said, hey, this seems to make sense, and here's a model to kind of explain it. And so I think that is why sometimes we can get a little bit more positive traction, because we're not isolated to either community, and we really try to serve both. We try to communicate the scientific findings as best we can, but at the same time make sure we're integrating the practical experiences from coaches, that do the damn thing, and actually kind of try to combine those things the best we can to deliver a kind of a holistic message that people can actually apply.
A quick example, just to jump in here, just to kind of make this concrete, is periodization. Generally speaking, in the research, you could definitely look at the research and come to the conclusion that periodization is not necessary to maximize strength gains. And I think that I agree that that's, generally speaking, probably a fair conclusion. But again, we have to keep in mind the limitations of the research. There's not a ton of studies that are longer than 12 weeks. A lot of the periodization research hasn't looked at some things we think might be beneficial to periodize, primarily intraset fatigue, which often translates to average RPE. So, that's just a concrete example of like, okay, here's what the research says, but in practice, we're going to go a different route because of XYZ and the limitations of the research. And like Zach said, piecing together what we can from 12-week training studies. So yeah, just kind of an example there.
And I think that kind of segues nicely into a question that we had about kind of what you think that next or current big research question is that either you think is going to be kind of grab a lot of attention or you personally would like to pursue. So like, what's that big research question in strength training that you'd like to see answered or pursued?
I think the resensitization question is the main one I have. I just think my mind often goes to just like pharmacological studies that look at like drug interventions, and desensitization happens with that almost always. And I just have a hard time believing that's probably not the case with resistance training, especially given the numerous anecdotes of people supporting that. Now, Mike T actually in RCS had a recent podcast that I thought was a good point, is that there probably is some positive selection bias with people talking about resensitization, because if you didn't have you had COVID layoff or lockdown or whatever, and you come back to training and you didn't have a really good experience for the first couple of months, you probably aren't posting on social media. So I think that is something to keep in mind. But I do think in our coaching experience too, I think this is something I've definitely kind of come around to. And I think it really relates a ton of different areas, whether you're talking about muscle growth and all of the super high volume studies. That's probably not practical for a really, really long time period. Like, you're not going to do 45 sets per muscle group for, the rest of your training career. Are there times that that's appropriate? Probably, and that probably builds the case for some type of volume cycling approach. And then similarly, when we talk about strength, maybe to this periodization model that we're kind of advocating for, maybe there's a 3-week period where we slash our training volume to 1/3 of what it is normally. And then now we can kind of, resensitize ourselves and get a much better return on investment when we come back to training. I think, the current narrative of training volume is more, and I think that's, to some degree true, but I think kind of exploring the other side of things here would also be a really, really interesting thing to do. And I think even applying this to kind of general population people, if we can have them exercise less and still retain a lot of the benefits or get an increased rate of gain when they come back, I think that's also something that's really, really powerful to kind of investigate. So I think just in general, that's kind of the main thing that I keep my eyes on, is anything related to resensitization, because I just think that has so many practical implications for a lot of people.
I think that's a really interesting topic, because we talk about how real world practice, or the research tends to lag behind the real world practice by a couple of years. And we talk about evidence-based versus evidence-limited, right, for that reason. And specifically with the resensitization example, you can go back to texts from Surin from like 1990, when block periodization was first published, right? And he talks about training residuals and maintenance dosages and improvement dosages, and really this idea that you can maintain and slightly improve with a much lower threshold of fatigue or intensity. And maybe it gets lost in the world of powerlifting, because the focus is so singular on strength within 3 movements, and you're not really having to juggle multiple training effects that are maybe contradictory on a biochemical basis, and not having to manage those things together in concert. So it gets lost because, we talk about periodization for powerlifting, and it's really like lifting weights heavy and lifting weights not quite so heavy. And Ryan will tell you how much that drives me up a wall when people start to conflate the powerlifting periodization versus programming, on a conceptual level, because that's just one of those things that's kind of a trigger for me.
Tom, you hitting 6s and 8s today, bro?
Yeah. So it's I think it's a really interesting thing to see how the approach and the perspective of these concepts differs between traditional sports, and even in stopwatch sports, where maybe like the sport coach is responsible for the strength and conditioning, and there's a more holistic view of outputs between strength and conditioning and specific and non-specific qualities, versus powerlifting, which is, if you're coaching powerlifting, the techno-tactical component of it is relatively very small. I mean, there's a lot to be said for being a good meet day coach, but in terms of being a good powerlifting athlete, if you're prepared well physically, you're probably going to be a pretty good powerlifting athlete. So I think it's interesting how the philosophies shape how those approaches are perceived between the two groups.
Josh, I want to give you the chance to answer that same question, but you can't steal Zach's answer. Don't steal Zach's answer. Let's hear it.
We talk about the resensitization thing a lot, just based on some anecdotes. So that would be my answer. Off the top of my head, I'll probably default to our bread and butter here in proximity to failure. I think this is largely because of this being a relatively new variable being investigated in the research. There's not to say there's not a decent amount of research on it, but I think we have a lot to iron out. I don't think it's impossible that 5 years from now we are saying something completely opposite of what we're saying. Again, I don't think that's going to be the case, but I think that option is still that possibility is still on the table, just because we have a long way to go in conceptualizing these things. And another thing I'd add is we have a long way to go in terms of ironing out our definitions in the research across different laboratories, et cetera. Again, no fault by any means to any researchers, but I think it's very hard to define what training to failure is. And one individual's RP10 and another individual's RP10 can be two completely different things. So I think ensuring that is consistent or at least well defined can better inform practical recommendations and our interpretation of the research. Because there's one possibility that maybe no researcher has actually studied a true RP10 in the laboratory. I don't think that's the case, but maybe there is something magical that just hasn't been investigated yet. There's also another possibility that, and I think this is more likely to be the case, is that researchers are often pushing subjects harder than people will push themselves on their own in the gym. So, when they are training to a given RP, really in practice, people are training a few RP points below that, especially for volume work. So again, I think there's two ends of the spectrum. The right answer is probably somewhere in the middle, but a lot of possibilities are still on the table. So that's kind of my default answer, our bread and butter, proximity to failure.
Mike?
Yeah. So that's actually a good segue to a question that I included kind of at the last minute on the outline here. And that is, for you guys, with some of the stuff you guys have talked about with like the low RPE talk, like how do you define it and how do you practically recommend people, I guess, train with it? Because so for me, because I like the idea in theory, but then I think about it and it's like, I can't actually think of a time that I've done an RPE 6 of something where I haven't been like, I don't know, like excited to train that day or like known that it was going to be a good day. Like I've never done like a bad day where like the bar felt like more than RP 6. Everything's RP 8 and above. It just becomes slow at some point. So I don't know, like, do you like separate like the emotional state from it somehow, or like what would you recommend to a novice RPE fiver wanting to join the movement?
Zach.
So I think there's a few ways to go about it. I think the way that we're generally going to do it, not to get into our whole talk on this too much, but I think the one thing that's really, really important when you are using some of those strategies, especially in the long term, is you need to make sure that the load is heavy enough. So in order to be able to train at those lower RPs and still see positive adaptations, and again, this is mostly based off the research here, probably need to be above a 10 RM or like 75% of 1 RM for the most part. And that's not to say if you go below that, you're not going to get any benefits. It's just saying to like be very confident you can get the exact same results with lower RPs. Load probably needs to be that heavy. So often the way that we will prescribe that is almost always in concert with some sort of top set prior to that. So, going back to the whole force production talk is that, the thing on the top of the pyramid or the highest in the hierarchy are heavy loads. So if you're doing a single at a 8 to 9 RPE, that's high RPE. But the reason that it's high RPE is because it's really heavy, which is in contrast to when you're really tired. The latter being a different reason that we probably kind of want to avoid. So as long as you're hitting that, that top set that you're probably more excited about psychologically, as long as you hit that, and then you kind of have a very accurate gauge of your strength for the day, then we can be pretty confident in assigning those low RP backoffs based on that estimated 1 RM. So pretty much always the way we'll do it is some type of top set, whether that be anywhere between 1 to 5 reps at a 5 to 9 RPE, just depending on how you want to do it. And then after that, we'll just take a percentage of that estimated 1 RM and kind of assign the back off work in that way. And so the other thing I'll say is that it's not necessarily that we're chasing a certain RPE range. That's not really the idea. It's just that at a given load, what we're trying to minimize is bar speed decline throughout a set. So, whether that means that you're training at a 7 RP or 5 RP, that's going to be dependent on the load. So the heavier you go, inevitably the RPs are going to be higher. We're just trying to minimize the bar speed decline throughout a set. So that'll be the primary way that we do it. If you're kind of more using the hypertrophy kind of protocol style, we'll often use what we call like a tester set, which is like a 6 to 8 reps at like a 7 to 8 RPE, again, with the idea being that we're trying to get that 10 RM load set. So that set is higher rep and higher RPE, but one set, we don't think the consequences are huge for that. And that's going to give you a really, really accurate gauge on that 10 RM load. And then from there, you can break up the load into like triples or 4s or whatever to get the rest of the volume in at a lower exertion and ultimately fatigue. So those are kind of the two strategies, depending on whether you're kind of more on the strength side of things, which would be the former, or kind of the hypertrophy side of things on the latter. That's kind of the two ways we want to do it. But hopefully you always have something to be excited about going into the session. You're not seeing 5 sets of 3 RP4 on your sheet, because I don't think I'd be very excited to do that either.
Yeah, we almost never say we never, when we prescribe an RPE, we would, or I'll take a step back and re-explain this. If we're going to have somebody train at a relatively low RPE, we're not going to prescribe the RPE. We're going to find a way to get them to accomplish that goal by having some sort of tester set. I don't feel confident in asking many people saying, hey, I want you to do 5 sets of 3, somewhere around 6 to 8 reps in reserve. Most people are going to botch that up, even if you're a very good lifter. So finding a way to get a tester set and to kind of set the percentage of 1 RM you want to use for that day is almost always necessary.
Tom, you got your hand raised?
Yeah, so kind of a tangent to that. One of the big criticisms that you always see about the rate of perceived exertion, when it comes to powerlifting and strength training, is that it's fundamentally a qualitative system, right? And the cool thing that Mike T did with it, back 10-ish, 15 years ago now, was take this qualitative assessment and translate it to some sort of quantitative program, right? And maybe he doesn't do this quite the same way now, but back in the day, he used these fatigue stops and measuring the change in RPE from set to set, at a given rest interval, et cetera, and all that stuff's real cool. And I do a lot of that still. I know Mike T doesn't think it's necessarily useful anymore. He's abandoned it, but I find it still very helpful. But we talk about this qualitative system, and the big criticism there is that it's not externally consistent, right? So like one person's RPE 8 may be a totally different proximity to failure for another person in terms of percentage of absolute max, right? Absolute intensity. And so so I'm good at reps, so I can do 5 reps at an RP 9 at like 85%, and somebody who's maybe more absolutely stronger, they're tapered out at like 78, and the people with the spreadsheets, certain segments, they just can't process that like people are different. There's individual differences there, and then, but tangential to that, there's the issue of like internal consistency, and I've kind of found that even internal to one lifter, and not even over long periods of time, within a single session, there can be huge variability in how they perceive the stress from a given load, or and so my question there is that you've got these issues of internal and external consistency, because it's purely qualitative assessment, but does it matter, right? Do you still get the training effect? I know if you go back to Michael Yesis's 1x20 system, right? I don't know if you guys are familiar with 1x20. It's kind of like a cool fad thing in the world of high school and collegiate strength conditioning right now, from the minimal effective dose philosophy. But Yesis did research and developed a system where he'd have lifters or athletes coming in relatively untrained or detrained, do a single set of 20, 3-4 times a week, every day, whatever, and he found that they were still satisfying force production in the early reps, even though they're working. Reps 1 through 10 are a very low RPE, and they're satisfying force production requirements in those early reps in the set, and as they approach failure with these longer sets of lighter loads, they're still developing maximal strength, because their proximity to failure is high, and obviously you get into some physiological issues when you get to really, really big sets, right? But in the domain of what we're talking here, a set of 3 versus a set of 10 versus a set of 20 in absolute terms, you're still engaging a lot of the same physiological stuff. So with that in mind, I guess my question is how do you see that with regards to these low RPE sets? And people look at that and say, oh, that's not intense, but there's not always a firm and hard link between your absolute intensity and your rate of perceived exertion and your proximity to failure in terms of repetitions. So those are kind of 3 variable aspects, and I'm not convinced anymore that it really affects the efficacy of the training.
Yeah, so I'm going to take this into the direction that I interpreted your question. If it's not exactly what you were asking, I apologize. But so the first thing I'd hit on is that, from more of a philosophical point of view, I think the variable of proximity to failure does exist, and that's independent of the RPE rating. It's just the way that actually is going to be reported by the athlete may not be exactly what we want to know. I guess that's the way I see it. So in our kind of the way we think about things, when I'm going to rely on using RPE, which, like you said, is an inherently subjective measure of effort, I'm going to set up the athlete in the position that I think it's going to be the most useful and they're going to be the most successful, which, based on the research, we know are probably low rep sets at a higher RPE. So that makes the candidate of top sets probably the best scenario to use RPE, which, like we just talked about, that's generally the one circumstance. So we're probably going to rely on that the most. Is, okay, this athlete's going to work up to a single at an 8 RPE, which is going to be above 90% and relatively high RPE. So it's going to be pretty accurate in general. And even if it's not exactly accurate, I don't think that totally diminishes its utility. And then from there, we're not really going to use that to prescribe load, and it's just going to be a descriptive measure from them. And from there, I don't know if we particularly care exactly what those RPEs are. It's just, keeping our finger on the pulse in terms of, okay, is this effort excessive in terms of what I would expect? So one question that Josh and I have actually got a few times that I don't think we've talked about and really fleshed out all the way is it the percentage of 1RM that matters, or is it the fact that it's a 10 RM load? Which those are two different things, like you very eloquently pointed out, is that, repetitions performed at a given percentage of 1RM while vastly differ between individuals. We have one study that goes from 6 to 26 repetitions at 70%. So really, really different between individuals. So we generally recommend, kind of alongside one another, 75% of 1RM or 10 RM load or heavier, and these low RP strategies can be efficacious. But those aren't always synonymous. So which is the kind of one that we primarily care about there? I am inclined to believe it's probably the 10 RM rather than the arbitrary percentage of 1RM. That just kind of is. We essentially say that because it correlates with the 10 RM, not the other way around. So I'm inclined to believe the 10 RM matters the most. So going back to your comparison between the 3, 10 instead of 20. I think that's going to be super, super dependent on the athlete and the way that you're measuring strength, probably. If they're pretty detrained, I would say in most cases, all of those are probably going to be relatively equal in the strength stimulus that they're going to provide. But if they're a little bit more specific in terms of like, okay, I'm training for a squat 1RM and I've been doing so for the past couple months, then I would say the higher intensities are probably going to be better just because of specificity. But I do think this is something I've been thinking more about recently, is those lower percentages of 1RM, could they be beneficial for strength for other reasons than what we would traditionally consider? But I'm gonna leave it there, just to make sure I actually address what you asked. But Josh, I don't know if you want to put some color on that, or that was just kind of how I interpreted your question.
Go for it, Thomas, if you have any follow-ups there, just to make sure we're hitting on your points.
Yeah, so I guess kind of what I was getting at is that the maybe where my thinking on this matter has gone over the past, what is it, Ryan, 6-8 months that I've been talking with you about this, is the maybe really what matters is the most is the perceived effort, not some definite constraint to a single event or a test, and then maybe obviously there's issues of specificity between a 1 rep max and a 20 rep max, and training for a 20 rep max is not going to be as specific as training for a 1 rep max, and you're into a whole another bag of issues in terms of fatigue management and sustainability with how long you can stay that close to 1 rep max. But maybe the real grease that makes the whole thing work is the effort, and not necessarily where that falls on a fixed scale, fixed relative to a one single performance or a daily test or what have you. But maybe Mike and I talk about staying in the pocket with his training, and he's really good at having this intuition about when to. He's great. Don't let him fool you. He knows what he's doing. He's the easiest client I've had in a long time.
Fuck.
But he does a really good job of kind of self-coaching and assessing. Is my effort on this where it should be? And I may tell him to hit something and then back off 10% and hit, a couple sets at this, and he may hit 2 of those 3 back off sets and say, no, I need to cut another 5% off of this to get the intent in terms of effort out of this set. And he's done a really good job of, when he does that, of maintaining good momentum in his lifts, just from workout to workout, week to week, and kind of using that intuitive approach. Obviously, he's a very experienced lifter, knows his body very well, so it works differently for less experienced people who maybe don't have that self-intelligence. But that was more of my train of thought there, is that the effort itself is what we're trying to describe when we talk about RPE or percentage of 1 rep max. We get hung up on these things from a quantitative perspective, but really what we're describing is an intensity, and that's an internal thing, right? And you go over the endurance world, They want to measure it by heart rate. That's the easy way people talk about training in zones. But then you also run into issues where there's confounding factors, where your heart rate zones are affected by like your external temperatures and the duration. So you may creep up out of what's traditionally zone 1 or zone 2 on a long endurance event, but you're still actually functioning within the same physiological parameters. And we're just not able to clearly define for all situations the intent as it relates to physiological outputs.
So Tom, if you have to kind of like plant your flag into the ground when assessing a metric by which to kind of operate on, it sounds like Zach and Josh are kind of grappling between, is it a percentage of 1RM or is it this 10RM figure? Those are the two terms that we want to like utilize. Which one is going to be more valuable when sitting down to actually write this stuff out? Like, what is your metric? Because you say intent, but I want to hear you like quantify what that actually is, what that looks like when you write it down on a spreadsheet.
Well, and that's the challenge with remote coaching, right? Because everything we do is to try to translate what we're thinking and what we could probably like watch a lifter do live and communicate like that needs to be less, that needs to be faster, that's too light, you know? And we're trying to communicate these things forward looking instead of with a rearward looking, where like, you know, we're not instantly assessing and adjusting when we write programs for distance clients, right? And so I guess really what I'm getting at is that when I talk about all these things, it's trying, for me personally, trying to more accurately communicate to a client that I can't interact with immediately and responsively or reflexively. What I mean by like, I want this to be a little heavier, or I want this to be snappy, you know, I want this to shake a certain way, you know, and it's kind of like jazz, right? It's not always the right note, but it's just the note. So I think that's the disconnect that a lot of people have with training, is that like, you can't just put it all into a spreadsheet, and we're not robots. You know, and I think you guys, from your material, I've been a big fan, and like, I share your stuff a lot on social. You know, the stuff you guys talk about, I think is really going in the right direction. But that's kind of where I am when I tell somebody that I want them, like Ryan, I tell you to hit a heavy-ish single, and like, you know, what that feels like. Yeah. Back out. Right. Or I tell you to, like, you know, you're doing rounds on something, and I tell you to get faster each round. You know,
I can do that too.
And then, you know, you initially struggled a lot with that, but you've kind of developed this
allegedly
this personal intelligence to where you can kind of feel like, I got to do 5 of these. Okay, I'm good on the first one. You know, like, this is too hot, right? So that's kind of where I was getting at is it's much squishier with me.
I think that's a very, very good point, and probably something we should talk about more often, because it is vital. And I think what you're getting at, I would probably conceptualize as just the general skill of training. And like, yes, you can put down a given protocol, right? You can get a training program and get a protocol, but there's, depending on execution, as well as, you know, kind of that skill of training, how, you know, what's actually applied is going to differ a good amount. So I think a big thing that comes to mind here for me is, how can we put like more tools in our tool belt in order to achieve what you're saying? So, you know, if we're trying to accomplish a certain goal, you know, what tools do we have at our disposal? So I guess something that we try to advocate for is putting more tools in our tool belt to do that. And then in terms of just to kind of go back to the stuff specifically related to like RPE and like percentage of 1RM versus 10RM load, I think a helpful way to conceptualize that is, let's say we have a given load on the bar for a given athlete. Let's say it's 300 pounds. I would say, in terms of the strength stimulus, well, to take a step back, if you were to do that load for one repetition, let's say it's 0.30 meters per second. I would conceptualize the strength stimulus you're getting from a given repetition is based on how close you can get to moving that load at the maximum velocity you can. So basically, as the repetition velocity decreases, the subsequent strength stimulus decreases, because your force production is decreasing. Because if we just think about F equals ma, basic physics equation, you know, if you're accelerating a given load, to a lesser degree, the force production is going to decrease. So I think probably where, it's probably two separate concepts of what are we actually trying to do and how are we conceptualizing the stimulus, but then how do we kind of auto-regulate that and use that as a skill of training, which another rabbit hole that we could go down is like volume auto-regulation, because I think that's ultimately kind of what you're getting at is like, okay, within a given session, how can we apply the proper dose of training that we're trying to get the desired training effect? And on a given day, we might need 10 units of training dose, but on another day, for whatever reason, we might need 6 units of training dose. Or another way to think about it is, okay, we're trying to apply 6 units of training dose, and to get 6 units of training dose on this day, we're going to need this load, but on another day, to get 6 units of training dose, we're going to need a different load. So I think it's probably two separate ideas that are not mutually exclusive, but are probably two separate discussions. So I don't know if that was a bit rambly, but Zach, go for it.
I'm going to go back to the meta discussion a little bit because I actually really like that, Thomas, and that was really thought provoking for me. What the kind of the analogy I wrote down on this notepad here, because that's how I do things, I guess.
Professional.
I think it comes down to the fact that we make a lot of assumptions in terms of an individual that everything's linear. So kind of the analogy I wrote in my head is like, if I have a given athlete and I write down all this stuff about them, relationships of how many reps they can perform at a given percentage of 1RM, how many weekly sets they need, all different kinds of stuff like that. Often the way, our brains are kind of programmed to do things is, I'm going to highlight that row in Excel and I'm going to drag it down, use that drag and drop function, and just think that everything is going to correlate linearly with whatever factors are in my life or different things like that. But the reality is nothing is like that. So like you said, Mike comes into the gym that one day and he is X less recovered or X less, has X less readiness to train or whatever. And our brains are like, okay, so that same exact relationship should be how much we should decrease training stress. But it's never like that. It's way more of an art. It's way more reflexive. It's way more, it's never that linear relationship. I guess that's kind of what I took from what you were saying. And I think the challenge is, like Josh said, is not holding ourselves to those directly linear relationships and trying to be a little bit more reflexive with this and figure out those patterns for every individual. And I think really the only thing that can do that reliably is just train longer and get better at the skill of training, like Josh said, to kind of combine that. But I think the concept kind of remains is that, like, no matter how many data points you have, no matter how many books you read, that linear relationship is probably never going to hold true. So you're never going to have, the right answer for every single situation. And some of it's just going to come down to, going by feel and understanding the concepts you're ultimately trying to kind of auto-regulate, I guess. So I don't know if that kind of gets at what you were talking about a little bit. I think I was understanding what you were getting after you kind of explained it the second time.
Yeah. So that's dead on. So, and we talk about like, I like that. Always training units, right, or volume units, right? And really, when we talk about sets, reps, load, really, volume and intensity are proxies that, like, our brains can. We've got heuristics that we apply here to, right, in all things, because we're humans and we perceive things a certain way. And then you get into a whole epistemological discussion there, right, about what you know. And yeah. And,
Big fan.
now, but all of this is really, it's just a proxy for stress, right? And the magnitude and the quantity of stress and like what that looks like in absolute terms and execution varies wildly day to day, person to person, set to set. Like, so the more targeted, and this is kind of like the point at which I think it was maybe like 2013, 2014, reading Mike T's stuff, that I was like, I saw the Matrix for a minute when I realized this, because it changed programming for me forever to realize, like, I'm not prescribing sets, I'm prescribing stress. And like, I'm trying to push an individual's body just enough, and then that's enough. And what that looks like may change day to day. And then I mentioned the fatigue stops. That was what, when I understood what he was trying to do there, that's where I understood, like, what he was talking about, right? So and that's kind of what I'm getting at, I guess. And I think the velocity-based thing is really interesting because I am admittedly not super well read on that. It's kind of hard to for me to access in my garage because the equipment's expensive or it's always out of stock if it's inexpensive. And then there's a lot of external variance there with people, that they have individual fiber types and motor abilities and technique and bar path and distance and everything. So you can't just say for one person, it's this many meters per second, right? But the idea that what you're looking at is an individualized threshold of bar speed and then exposures above an individualized threshold of relative intensity. That's not something that I had really framed that way for myself mentally, so I'm going to have to go lose some sleep over that.
Something that came up when you were talking is again, we sometimes slightly regret the name of our company because you might assume don't get me wrong, we try to make the spreadsheets we use pretty fancy, but something we do like to keep is open text for where we write our training protocols for athletes. So you might assume okay, we have a column for number of sets, a column for number of reps, column for number for RP, whatever. But we like to keep those open text because a lot of the stuff you're talking about in terms of the skill of training and kind of going by feel, we feel, yes, obviously mentoring an athlete and helping that, helping them work on that over time can also be kind of baked into the program a little bit. So if you want to put an RPE cap on there, so it's okay, we work up to a given RPE and maybe we put a note in there that, hey, if you feel bar speed is dropping set to set a bunch, just go ahead and cut it. Or, hey, I want you to work up to a top triple at, something that keeps your symptoms below a given threshold, et cetera. So even if you can still combine kind of this data savvy way of going about things and also talk about that skill of training and, kind of the softer skills of training.
That was literally what I was going to say, because I was actually going to say something to Mike that I think you kind of thought it was kind of weird when I sent you the kind of rough outline of what I was planning to do, and I had some prescription that was 5 at little to no symptoms or something like that. I write training like that all the time, which is super, super non-descriptive based on previous conversations with the athlete, exactly how I'll contextualize those words. But I write stuff like that pretty consistently, and all the time I'll write top sets that there's not an RPE there, it's just words. And it sounds very similar to you, Thomas. I just want it to feel heavy but not too slow. And that it's not really an RPE, it's just kind of you know what it is. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, no, I use we use that open text feature all the time, and I think it kind of aligns with what you're talking about. Is we're ultimately going after this physiological thing that our brain has correlated numbers to that really don't mean anything. And it's just we're trying to find the best proxies in terms of metrics that are actually describing the physiological event that we're trying to make happen. So I don't know, Mike, if you have anything to say on that, but that churned in my brain when Josh said that.
Yeah, no, I actually loved it. And so I use similar cutoffs and stuff like that with rehab a lot because I think pain-free is the obvious one. Okay, don't let it get into pain. And it's well, it's not quite that granular. It's probably okay if it hurts a little bit, but I don't want it to hurt a lot. And I'm also not going to ask you to be I've made this mistake before. I'm don't let it exceed a 5. And then people are oh my God, was it a 4? Was it a 5? I don't know. And it's it when you feel it, right? It's if it's not right, it's not right. You gotta learn to trust your judgment on that, which is that skill of training, which rocks. This is the best conversation ever, by the way. I feel bad for people who are not on this podcast right now. And yeah, you just kind of let that guide your training because, ultimately that's what we're trying to do. And yeah, so I really like that a lot. And I don't have it in front of me now. I wish I did, but you had one, because you had 2 different, intensity governors, and they were kind of saying the same thing, but
absolutely,
they were different. And they were different.
No symptoms, and then I think it was little to no symptoms, I think is what it was.
Yeah, basically the same thing, but not the same. So it's but only and if you had a coach doing it or anything like that, would kind of know what those things correlated with. So no, I thought that was awesome. I love it.
So to double back real quick about the brand for you guys, I don't know if maybe other people perceive it this way, but when you guys talk about data-driven strength and the way you interpret that, that's not how I interpret it at all, actually. So when you guys talk about it, maybe it's like my personal biases and how I approach training and philosophy. When I saw it, I kind of took it from more like a sabermetric perspective, right? And that you're constantly collecting data about your clients and you're honing the approach as you go. And every decision, I know you guys made posts about this, decisions with clients, with athletes are driven by what you know and what you've seen and observed with that client versus like anonymous avatar 42069, whatever, because this one ebook said 3 sets of whatever is the way to go, if that's what we're going to do, but this person's stronger, it did none of that, but really like taking a look at the individual and growing the program around them, and having the ability to take best practices and to take information from their training and how they feel and how they respond to it and adjust and manipulate. Just like you're making a soup, you want to put just enough salt in it, and you don't know how much broth you got already, so you gotta kind of apply the taste test, and then just right.
Maybe this is a post hoc rationalization, but I think we can kind of squeak our way out of that by saying that data includes kind of all inputs. So like, yes, the obvious one is like the concepts we can gather from the research. But if you have data to indicate that, whether that data is something objective you're seeing in a spreadsheet, or it's something subjective you have gathered through conversations or body language, et cetera, like I would consider that data as well. Just kind of, again, defining data as all inputs. So, all those things can integrate for the given individual to produce something that, like you said, hones in on, just kind of reducing the error bars for that individual over time.
I concur.
Yeah, I think it's maybe like that, the gap there between like vulgar empiricism and then like true evidence-based but not evidence-limited practice, where you acknowledge there's things you don't know or you can't explain, and there's relationships that you perceive but can't fully define the relationship of, the nature of, and there's a lot of, again, back to the epistemological, like what you know, what you don't, how you know. So it's very cool. Yeah, that's how I perceived y'all's brand. So don't feel like you're pigeonholed to
you're charitable,
being some PubMed nerds. I think you're doing.
Yeah, we appreciate the charitability, and just really quick, one of our other coaches, Jake, he uses this term often. I don't know if he came up with it, but I'll credit him for him. He says evidence-based, but not science only, and I think that really hits home. It's like, yes, you can use this as your compass, but like not blindly follow the research evidence. So just throwing that out there.
You've heard the phrase "absence of evidence versus evidence of absence," right? And that's probably we're all tracking the same spot there.
Man, I just listened to this conversation. I think these guys, well read, they can verbalize so well spoken. What the hell got you guys into academia? Don't you know how rich you could be in private practice? Is that the big thing here? We're going, as soon as DDS goes to the moon, it's bye-bye Dr. Zordos. How are you going to say goodbye to him? Is it going to be like a poop sack on his desk kind of thing? Is it going to be like you throw money in his face? What's the exit plan there?
Well, he's got me tied down for another however long it's going to take me to do my PhD. So I probably am not going to hold back any further commentary here. But I don't know if Josh wants to take any personal stances before he really officially gets into the lab work for his master's here.
No, I mean, the academia stuff is awesome. And I think, again, I'm going to try to not make this too political, but I don't think we could do one. I don't think we could do one in isolation better than if we weren't to do both. So like having the academic side improves the practical side. The practical side improves the academic side. So, and also like it's more fun that way, just from a personal, selfish level. So, I think we'll probably be in the academic realm for the foreseeable future for sure.
I think it's one of those things that like I'm careful in the way I say this, but I think it is true to some extent. Like you can't truly appreciate some research or interpret it as correctly as maybe you should until you've had a hand in it. Like, we've all been the kid on, or seen the kid, I guess maybe it was just me on T Nation saying, well, I was just studying only 6 weeks, bro. That's dumb. It's just like that kind of thing is like, while true, it's, getting into the real world and just understanding how painstakingly difficult it is to convince a 19-year-old at the rec center with the stringer on that, yes, sir, I know I'm skinnier than you, but you should, do this training study with us. And we have, the leader of our lab is renowned in the world at this stuff, and you should really just come lift weights in our lab. And it's just so difficult to get people to say yes to that. And it's just understanding that and just like really truly intimately understanding the limitations of research, having your first hand at it, I think gives us a little bit more perspective when we're translating that stuff. And I think like I said, I think it gives us an additional lens to help us with the translation process, because it essentially makes you aware of certain limitations that you may not otherwise consider if you weren't to participate a little bit. So like example Josh always talks about is the paper says they train to failure, but think about that from a logistical perspective in research. You can't force somebody to go to failure. That's a dangerous event. And when you're doing the ethics of a study, you can't do that. So that's immediately a consideration you have to have in mind when they say that they train to failure. It's like, you can't force somebody to do that. So they maybe didn't. And it's just like having some of that clarity after participating in research, I think is something that helps us ultimately with the practical stuff. So I would agree with Josh totally, I think. And then also doing the practical stuff is going to fuel us asking relevant questions in the lab. So I think that joining those two things together ultimately benefits both sides. And I think, as Josh said, I don't think I could see myself not participating in either for the time being. But, as I said, we'll leave that to Mr. Boss Man, and hopefully he doesn't kick us out of the lab anytime soon.
I thought of two things when you said that. The first was something that Josh said about like tools in the tool belt, and having that background in academia is itself another tool in the tool belt of being in the lab, knowing how that kind of having that hands-on experience of that. And the second was, I think there's a lot of individuals who are somewhat of like academia doomers, where it's like, oh, like you don't need to go and work in a lab and get that degree, like just cut your teeth working online, or drop on down at the local LA Fitness and start training there. Don't worry about, Tom, coming for you. Don't just get your experience there instead of. But those same people will have what you just said of like, oh, this study sucks. Like, why do none of these researchers lift? Like, they clearly aren't like in the know. They aren't woke on training. And it's just it's a lot of people. I think back to like the meme conversation we have. It's like a lot of people poking holes from the sideline and trying to single you guys out, or single folks like you that do similar work to you guys out, without understanding that like y'all are on the front line doing the thing. And if I could give you a hug, I would, maybe even a kiss. It wouldn't be too wet.
One thing I just want to clarify, so I don't not sleep tonight. I don't want to be like saying not everybody can utilize science, because they definitely can. It's just, I think it's like you said, it's another tool in our tool belt to actually have participated in collecting data. But that's not to say that if you haven't had academic experience, it's still not a useful tool. And you can still be aware of the limitations, by conversations with people that actually have collected data and all that good stuff. So I don't want to be a gatekeeper in that sense. I think everybody can utilize it to their benefit. I just wanted to make that clear. I won't be able to sleep.
Mike mentioned earlier mass. Like do I think like I could research and interpret it right now if I didn't, pursue academia? No, but like honestly, when I first started reading research, I'd just like get somebody interpreting that I trust the research, and then pull up the full paper next to it and say, okay, what did I mess up here reading it myself? Like there are ways to do it, and like some of the smartest people and most well-read people we know didn't do any of the academia stuff. So I think the barriers in the fitness industry can be a curse at time, but I also think it's a blessing, and it when utilized properly, is really cool. Like, again, I know multiple people that are very, very smart, very well read, understand how to interpret research, not poking holes from the sideline, and they haven't stepped foot in an exercise science program, which is totally fine. And the last thing I'll add here really quick is just that I think people's expectations about what the goal of academia is, or like an undergraduate exercise science program, might not be what they think at face value. So like, you're not going to an exercise science program to learn the best powerlifting training cycle. Like, you're going to, at the end of the day, what you're going to get is a really nice foundation of physiology, how that applies to acute and chronic exercise, hopefully a little bit of biochemistry, basic chemistry, biology. And that gives you kind of the critical thinking framework and the just overall physiology framework to apply going forward. And then when they don't get that, it's like, oh, this is a waste of time. It's like, well, what exactly are we here for, and what is the program preparing you for? Because yes, you want to be a powerlifting coach, but also the other person in your major is pre-med. You have a pre-physical therapy person. This person's going to go be an exercise physiologist at the hospital. So it's like, what exactly are we doing here? And then you can kind of specialize down the road.
I just wanted to add one more thing in here, Thomas, real quick. I also think it's interesting when
Keeper.
Yeah, sorry. I'm so bad. I'm terrible. I also think it's interesting too, like when people from other academic spheres like give their 2 cents on exercise science. I think that's also really, really interesting. Like Josh said, we have a ton of friends that are like really well read, but like don't come from exercise science or health science related fields, and like have really, really interesting takes. So I think that's another thing to consider. Like, having a scientific skill set is not limited to the field. And often the most productive conversations are like cross field conversations. Like, we have a friend that's like super, super well versed in physics and stuff like that can help us with some of the like the mechanisms of like neuromuscular stuff, because he knows the physical equations so well. So I just think those crosstalk conversations too. So like having a scientific skill set can be useful in a ton of regards. So I think the same kind of reflexive thing is true. If you learn some stuff about exercise science, whether that be formal or non-formal, you can apply that to other areas of your life, which is pretty cool. But Thomas, go ahead. I'm done gatekeeping.
Oh, I was just going to tell Ryan, want to make sure that pointed out where we said that you didn't have to be, because I'm the self-appointed dumbest person on the team. So I'm the least qualified coach at Gifted. I got a business degree, a minor in psychology, and I work in the project management space outside of what I do with Gifted. So I'm the guy on the sidelines. That's me. I'm that guy, and
he is the doomer.
It was really interesting for me when I started working with Gifted and talking to especially Paul, because Paul was at the time still working on his master's and really like heavily engaged with research. And I kind of had this I hate to say like vulgar empiricist bias, right? Where I'm looking at the study says this, it's study, it says it, can't argue with that, right? And since I didn't have, I've got some undergrad psych research exposure, but so I should have seen it coming in terms of like underpowered and vague conclusions, right? It's like soft studies. But Paul was like, man, this stuff is it's not that simple. And since I didn't have the exposure to the lab side that say like Mike or Ryan with their educational credentials, I didn't have that. So it was kind of like eye opening for me when he's talking about, we had n equals 9, and I'm like, what? N equals 9? You can't. What? And he goes, yeah. And it was 9 undergraduate frat boys who were probably drunk the night before, and so there's a lot of, like you talked about, contextualization of data. There's a lot of that there that I don't have, and I lean on these guys for like, hey, what does this mean? Especially Hector, because he's just like suffered through the worst.
Rest in peace.
Yeah.
Rest in peace. What is Hector even getting his PhD in? Like cellular biology or something insane?
I think he's getting his PhD in laboratory failures.
Yeah, I think the one thing I was going to add there is that I think a lot of times that can be used. So my dog's over here. Hopefully she's not.
Not as loud as mine.
one thing I was going to say is that like when you're viewing problems in coaching, though, I think if you haven't been pushed down that same railroad track that everybody goes down in like undergrad exercise science and views the problem from the exact same way, I think that's oftentimes when the most creative solutions can come to like a given problem. So I think the fact that you have like a group of coaches that all have slightly different backgrounds, like obviously you come from a different place, Thomas, Mike's the physical therapy route, Ryan maybe a little bit more traditional, like all kind of combining your different views of the problem, I think are the best way to come to solutions, rather than everybody, is like looking at a skyscraper from the right side. You maybe don't see the hole on the left, like that kind of thing, I think is something that's useful. So I don't always view like not having a traditional, like whatever view of exercise science as a negative. Cause I often think like, you guys are all looking at it this way. This is stupid. Why don't you like think about it from this angle? It's way more, it's like, this is obvious. And it's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But everybody, viewed the same, NSCA textbook from 2005 and they're like, no, it's this way. You know what I mean? So I think that's often an advantage that isn't considered sometimes too.
So I have a monitor right here behind my laptop right here, and the kickstand or what's propping that up is that exact textbook that you're talking about. I got 2 copies of it on each side under each leg of my TV.
How many reps for muscular endurance go?
Oh yeah, it got to be 15 plus. Got to keep those rests short. Really got to burn it. He's got it. Everyone, bring out your essentials textbook.
Yeah.
What's the height of the mirrors for the plates?
16 inches?
No, so wrong. Failed.
26.
Right.
Yeah, no, I think it's 36, isn't it? 3 feet of clearance.
6.
Yeah, you failed too. Yeah,
I was going to say. I was going to say
that's a master's in PE. So yeah, we've got all those on the shelf here.
Hell yeah! I was going to say that that kind of reminds me of, I forget the author, but it's like one of those like well-known New York Times authors. But the book Range kind of came to that similar conclusion that having a diversity of opinions or a diversity of experience typically is a benefit in most cases. So I think that's awesome points.
That's an excellent book, and I think you have the Malcolm David Epstein kind of challenged the Malcolm Gladwell, and they've had super good public discussions about kind of this nitty gritty specialization versus this more generalist approach. And I think there's also the book Grit by Angela Duckworth, which kind of opposes range in some ways. And this is a topic I found super interesting. And I think there's, you kind of need people on the ground in the lab with the nitty gritty stuff. Okay, what's the next layer of information? How do we push that circle of human knowledge to the next level? But you also need the birds in the sky from the high level point of view, the generalists to kind of, okay, how do we integrate this? Hey, you guys are pushing the circle of human knowledge in the wrong direction. Let's go this way instead. So I think we have to have the people on the ground, the nitty gritty, and then we can also have people from the high level giving their input. So just want to jump in because I like that topic, and I spent a lot of quarantine thinking about it via Range and Grit and some of Malcolm Gladwell stuff.
How about Sports Gene? Have you read that one?
That's an awesome book.
Oh,
that's another
book. Classic. Love it.
So I think that's
doing Endure right now.
Oh yeah,
Endure, similar type of book. Also would recommend. So
Mike, my birthday is coming up. Not even close, but kind of. You want to send me an Audible credit so I can also get Endure, and we can nerd out on that together.
I got you.
Thank you. I appreciate you.
So I think that's interesting. Just from my personal professional background, like I said, I work in kind of the project management space, and without getting too specific about what we do, we build large, complex nuclear construction projects. So and they're all one-off, unique things. It's not a stamp and go reactors like they do in China. But what we
Shots
do,
fired.
a lot of it's just kind of bespoke, right? And so you have this really interesting dynamic within the project teams where you've got you usually have a project engineer or an engineering director who is the technical brains, and then you've got a guy who maybe understands a little bit of it, and he's got usually the project manager has a stronger business acumen, or maybe that guy is got a good regulatory acumen. He understands what we're working through in terms of codes, and then you've got an additional director of controls who's the business guy, and he understands the numbers. And so you've got the hard numerical, empirical stuff on the engineering side. You've got the soft skills and the construction management and the project management side. You've got the super unique skill set of working with regulatory bodies and federal clients, and then the business side, which is purely numbers and finance and budgeting and what have you. And all of those perspectives kind of form the core of what the project needs. Because if you just had just an engineer, and I've been on jobs where it was all engineers running the show, and my whole family's engineers, don't get me wrong, but they think about things a certain way and they do things a certain way. And you're really lucky if they don't run themselves into a corner because of how they're wired. And that's really useful for their specific function, but that perspective may not serve the bigger picture.
And I don't want to go too far off of that, but Josh, something that you said that's currently burned into my brain that I'm gonna probably steal, probably take credit for it, never really cite you at all whatsoever. But you said that a lot of exercise science majors, they go into the degree with the mindset of, I'm going to learn how to write powerlifting programs. And I think it's a really good discussion there about, wanting to dig into the methods before you understand the principles. And what you said was like, hey, zoom out and I'm going to teach you the principles, and then the methods are many from there. There's many roads to Rome from there. And I think Mike had a very specific question about program design. I think it was about a post that you guys had made that particularly piqued his interest.
Yeah. So I was just going to ask, what, to anybody out there, be it coaches who are coaching lifters or athletes who just want to be better at training, what specific thing do you think we could do better to get more out of training or more out of our execution, be it from a programming standpoint, everybody should be doing, sets of 5 at 8 or something like that, sets of 3 at 5, I don't know, or execution, everybody should be, doing a bunch of weird foot and diaphragm stuff. I don't know what you guys are into, but yeah, just from y'all's standpoint, what are the two highest, or not two, I guess. What's the highest value thing that you think most people could do to immediately, or, in the short term, improve, I guess, their training outcomes?
I have a few things that come to mind. So I don't know if there's one big thing just that jumps out at me right away, but I guess I'll probably think through this in terms of if I have a new athlete in front of me. Typically, when I see their previous training, there will be a lot of similarities across different previous training programs. And what are the most common things I'll change, with their new programming? And a couple things come to mind. The first is allocating a little bit more training volume towards movements that are kind of optimized for growing the prime movers. So I think a lot of powerlifters will get, the bodybuilder shaking his head. A lot of powerlifters will get caught up in accumulating all their training volume doing the main lifts. And of course that's necessary to some degree, but that's a change we often make. Is almost every time I have somebody do a competition bench slot or a competition squat slot, it'll almost always be followed up by a hypertrophy variation. Obviously there's exceptions to that, but that's kind of how we set things up. Is okay, we have our we're having the dose of training we need on the main lift to continue to develop skill and confidence with heavy loads, as well as technique development with the main lift. But then after that, it's okay, what's the point of accumulating more volume? The point of accumulating more volume is to drive muscle growth. How can we best drive muscle growth? Let's do that on something that's very well suited for this individual. Some people, the comp squat might be very well suited for them to grow their quads, but a lot of people it isn't. So let's get them on something that kind of maximizes that return on investment for them. Another thing that comes to mind is kind of psychological periodization. And this is something that's been on my mind because, it sounds like I stole it from Zach. Psychological periodization is that again, I talked about how I wouldn't say there's convincing evidence to indicate that everybody needs to periodize their training for strength. But again, we still do periodized training in practice. And generally speaking, we break it up into hypertrophy focus phases and strength focus phases. And I'm almost hesitant to call it that because it's a very small shift in bias, because really the largest shift in bias comes from the psychological approach. So we're very much in favor of keeping top sets in for powerlifters year round. But by A, the actual protocols, and B, the psychological approach to those top sets, the kind of emphasis of the phase can be shifted. So, okay, how can we ensure we maintain that skill and that practice and that confidence with heavy loads while not digging ourselves into a hole for the rest of the session, so that when we get to our leg press, our high bar squat, whatever, and we're trying to actually grow the quads, because that's probably going to be your best long-term investment. How do we program that for the given individual? And then, okay, now we're in the strength focus phase. Yes, we're still going to be doing some of that more hypertrophy focused work, but we do it in a low fatigue strategy. And now we can kind of have some controlled aggression for those top sets. So those are the two that come to mind, is kind of volume allocation at large, and jumping off of that is the psychological approach to those different sets for, whether it's the competition lift or close variation versus more hypertrophy focused slots.
Yeah, I very much agree with the psychological one. That was the one I was going to hit on, and I'm going to try to take that and expand on it in a different way of like why I also think that's important. And I think, Josh hit on some specific programming things that we talk about, I think, but just kind of a more meta point that I think literally every single lifter can do regardless of what they're doing is just understanding that the training you're doing today is going to need to be adjusted. And to actually be moving forward to where you want to go, you need a system of some kind. Now, there's a ton of debate in the training world right now of what's the best way to set up this system of individualization. You have RTS with emerging strategies. We've talked a little bit about this and kind of our preferences, but I don't really think there's a right way to do it. But I do think that having a system and very specifically making adjustments over time is a huge thing that I hope more people can understand, because ultimately what that does is it gives you what we like to call diagnostic clarity. So when you're making a change, I know because I'm making small changes or hopefully even an isolated change that this did or didn't work or led to the outcomes that I'm seeking. So I think just understanding that is going to kind of drive some programming things inevitably. And I think you're probably going to start on a little bit more of a realistic amount of volume, intensity, all that kind of stuff, because the goal being, okay, I'm going to start with something that's realistic, and if it doesn't work, I'm going to make a change based on my system. So you're going to start a little bit more conservatively. That will lead to consistency, which I think is a huge part of diagnostic clarity. Going back to the psychological arousal piece, if you have these huge fluctuations and getting super hyped up for some sessions, and it's not the same session every week, and it's just you have a ton of fluctuations in that psychological arousal, I think that automatically is going to impact your readiness to train as well. And you kind of compound those two things together. The data that we're getting from training, go back to the overly data reliant approach, but that's not what I mean right now. But going back to the data you're getting from the training, it's going to be in different contexts. So you can't really compare apples to apples. And our goal with long-term training is to have a system that allows us to make incremental changes over time and get closer to optimal outcomes. But if you just kind of start training and start making a tons of changes week to week because you see a fad on Instagram, hopefully we're not contributing to that too much, or you're just seeing tons of things you want to change because stuff happened throughout the week, I think that is going to probably be a net negative for most people. So I think starting with the system, however you want to organize that, and just making sure that you're making, incremental changes over time to have a high amount of diagnostic clarity, I think is going to be a net positive for pretty much everyone, and will be coinciding with some kind of more realistic and consistent programming strategies. But psychological arousal was my first answer, so hopefully that was okay. But Josh stole it, so.
Guys, I think the chef's kisses on this episode here, this little 90 minutes that we've thrown down here, are going to be so plentiful that it will demand a second episode. So if you'll come back, we'll have to dig into some of these topics a little bit earlier, but we do want to, or a little bit more, but we do want to be respectful of your time. I want to give you a chance to kind of plug the social medias, the projects that you're currently working on. For everyone who wants to read more about these guys right here, what they're currently offering, what they're kind of throwing down, if you smell what they're stepping in, you can find all the links below in the bio. But I do want to give you a chance to talk about your offerings, your amuse-bouche of tasty powerlifting treats.
Oh man, if you find us on Instagram, so mine is just Josh.Data-driven strength. Zach's is Zach.Data-driven strength. Kind of have everything linked there. I don't want to make this a sales pitch by any means. I mean, we have like one-on-one coaching. We also have some lower cost options now. So if you're interested in that, you can check it out. If you think some of our ideas we are off base here, shoot us a message. We're more than happy to chat. Again, like we talked about, if it's productive discussion, we love it, and that'll ultimately get us closer to the truth. So, and that's what we're after. So, yeah, you can find us there, and that's kind of our central hub.
Thanks for having us on, guys. Appreciate it.
Yeah,
had
very
fun.
much appreciate it.
Love to come back.
Mike, Tom, anything you want to close with?
I just wanted to say that
Chef
if
kisses.
you disagree with anything I've said today, you can fight me.
So we used to have a series on the Gifted page called Fight Me Friday, where we would just get Tom riled up. We'd put him on Crowder's face, Photoshop him on Crowder's body, and just let people fight. I think my favorite one was when Charlie Jung came on and said that bodybuilding periodization did exist, and Tom's response was, "Well, somebody has to be wrong." And that was my personal favorite. All right, guys, as always, do the YouTube stuff, like, comment, subscribe, blah, 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 notification bell. I'm sure that's a thing as well. And as always, guys, stay gifted, and we love you. See ya.
This is the part where we all flex. Flex, everybody.
Oh, yeah, that's my sleeve tearing. You didn't hear it? Well, it happened.